Chapter 5. Cedric.
All right, how many fingers am I holding up now?
Evander asked Cedric, holding his hand in front of his face. Cedric suspected that the doctor was trying to appear sympathetic, but it sounded more like patronage with every preceding word that fell from his lips. The pair of long fingers wagging gently at him, not 3 inches from his face, only added to that.
I'm guessing that you're expecting me to say 7,
Cedric groaned, shooing away a maid who raised a wet cloth to his throbbing head. She quickly apologized and ducked away, disappearing into the background with the rest of the nurses and servants at his beck and call. His room felt invaded by the number of people just standing around, waiting for something to do. Despite his many requests, they had yet to leave, as if he weren't in charge. More than half a dozen soldiers, all of his personal guard included, stood at attention, waiting for an unseen threat to show itself. Evander gave him an appraising look, thin lips drooping to a frown.
No, actually.
2. You are holding up 2 fingers. Cedric sat impatiently in his bed, layers of thick quilting bunched over his legs, making them uncomfortably warm. They had been at this for a good half-hour, and though Cedric's vision had cleared significantly, he didn't see the necessity of doing so many tests.
Good. Now, just follow my quill with your eyes.
The doctor proceeded to slowly move his pen from side to side, studying the prince's face closely. Instead, Cedric stared at him and was rewarded as the man cleared his throat, his eyes darting nervously towards the maid who stood at his side, a plate of ointments and bandages held in her still hands. She only offered a subtle shrug, her lips pursed tightly as she watched Cedric cautiously. Cedric huffed and did as he was told, looking back and forth in time with the stiff feather. Evander, visibly relieved, nodded as if this simple act was all the confirmation he needed.
Well, you seem to be fine now, though I do have to admit that your first answers were worrying. The recovery process seems to have already started. If you don't mind, I'd like to do one more test.
No, Cedric said immediately. No more tests. I've asked several times for everyone here to just leave me be.
2 days,
Evander sighed, putting down his pen and folding his page of notes.
Take this to Dr. Harcourt. He'll analyze everything and pass on the information to the king,
he told the maid in a hushed, sickly sweet voice. She nodded, blushing at his smile, and swept herself from the room.
You were saying?
Cedric asked, leaning back in his bed, letting himself be absorbed by the plushness of the cushions.
Ah, yes, right. So, 2 days.
Evander pushed his glasses up his nose and tried to give the prince his most apologetic smile.
You are suffering from a mild concussion. No memory loss or anything too worrying. But the effects could get worse if you don't rest for 2 consecutive days. No swords, no athletic activities, no roughhousing, etc. You get the gist. Pretty much the only options you have are...
He gestured towards the bed.
This.
Cedric snorted.
We can get you back into your previous schedule starting then, he continued. But slowly. No sparring, hunting, horseback riding, or anything of the like for the next week.
Cedric huffed again.
What if I need to?
Evander narrowed his eyes.
Just don't, Your Highness. We don't want to make any damage worse.
He was right, of course. Cedric could tell that much. His head throbbed enough that he knew he'd drop if he tried to walk, much less try to pick up a sword. That didn't mean he wouldn't protest. How's Pearson? He ended up asking instead of firing back a retort. A lump rose in his throat as he expected to hear the bad news.
Alive,
Evander sighed, rising from his chair.
Harcourt says that he was knocked out with some kind of chemical. He woke right up after smelling some salts.
So he's all right. Cedric breathed out heavily, some of the knots in his stomach beginning to loosen. Harcourt, the palace's physician, was as trustworthy as anyone inside its walls.
Well, maybe not all right. He's feeling ill, but he's better off than you, Highness.
Evander nodded towards Cedric's head.
Now remember, he chimed, full rest for the next 2 days. If I see you out of bed...
Cedric scowled at the idea, but reluctantly nodded.
I get it. No need to tell me a 10th time.
Evander pursed his lips and nodded farewell to the others in the room, ducking swiftly away. Sighing, Cedric slammed his head against his pillows, instantly regretting it as his head split with pain. He groaned, his hand flying to rub his temple. Immediately, a nurse shot forward, cloth in hand. Cedric held out a hand to stop her, and she halted in her path, eyes wide.
"Prince, is there any way I can help you? Anything at all?"
"No, please, just leave me be. All of you. Everyone. Now." They stared at him with uncertainty, almost seeming to wait for further confirmation of his words. Their wide eyes bore into him as if blinking would make him drop dead. He waved to them again, this time more insistent.
"What about security, Highness?"
a soldier from his personal guard asked, voice even and laced with years of practiced stability. "2 vigils by the door. I promise. I'll be fine. No, please, let me sleep." One by one, the servants began to shuffle out of the door, each bowing their heads as they passed, which only infuriated Cedric more. He wanted people to stop worrying about him so he could worry about himself for a moment. As soon as everyone was gone, the weight of everything finally settled on his shoulders. He had almost been assassinated. Someone had actively been trying to kill him. Just the fact that the man had been put under lock and key did nothing to calm his racing thoughts. He'd almost died. He ran a hand through his hair, careful to avoid the bruise that had made a home on his skull. His life had been intense, but intense training and lectures. Not like this, with blood and the real, raw fear for your own life. Somehow, he'd managed to stay alive. Somehow he was here, with only a mild concussion. There was a matter of relief in that, but mostly it just worried him. What the man had said, that all of the guards were gone. How gone exactly? Though he suspected that they had all been killed. He'd just have to hope for something a little brighter. But either way, if the assassin had managed to get rid of every guard on duty watching the courtyard, then why had he not succeeded in dispatching Cedric at the very beginning? Had he possibly stalled so he could get taken? What was his game? Cedric heaved out a heavy sigh, forcing his eyes shut. The plush pillows did nothing to help ease him into a state of sleep, despite his efforts. Rest, Evander had said. Easier said than done. How could he rest when his life had almost met its end? It was a haunting thought, and one that he suspected would keep him from true rest for longer than his 2-day suspension. The door to his chambers creaked open slowly, followed by a girl, her dress rimmed by a dark stain of blood. Her eyes were wide and her golden hair askew. Clearly she hadn't made any kind of effort to fix her appearance. She was exactly as she looked in the courtyard, scared and haunted, but somehow a warm sight. Cedric found he was glad she was here. "Hey," Gwyn said, ducking past the guards as they gave her skeptical looks. "I hope I'm not intruding." Her eyes wandered around the room, lit only by the flickering flames of the hearth at the end of the room and moonlight itself finding its way through the balcony window. She tensed, as if expecting a shady figure to withdraw from the shadows, weapons dripping blood red. Don't worry. There have been several extensive searches of this room. I can assure you that there is no one hiding in the shadows out to kill me." Cedric tried to crack a smile, but he felt his left side pull with pain from the stitches across his cheek where the assassin's dagger had cut him. Gwyn laughed nervously, refusing to meet Cedric's eyes as she lowered herself into a chair several feet away from the side of the bed. I just came to see how you were doing. I hope Evander didn't give you a hard time. He can get a little weird. I think I gave him a harder time than he gave me. Cedric waited for her to respond, but all he got was another nervous series of huffs that might have been a laugh. Are you all right? He asked finally after a period of silence. Her head snapped up, blue eyes wide. Me? Oh, I'm fine. I've just never seen a dead body. No, that's a lie. I have seen a few, just never like that. Her voice got hollow and her eyes fell on her hands, which were clutched tightly in front of her. But I mean, all things considered, it wasn't that, bad. It's not like I almost died. She stopped herself, flushing as she stole a glance up at Cedric. Sorry, too soon? Kings, I don't even know why I'm here. I should just go. Cedric started laughing under his breath, holding out a hand to get her to stop from rising from the chair. Don't apologize. You're okay. She stared at him, confused for a moment. Then, biting her lip, she lowered herself back into her seat. You and your father seem to think everything I say is really funny, Gwen said, sucking in a breath. I just don't know where the rambling came from. Sorry, but it was a little funny. He thought he saw a smile peek out from her nervously pursed lips as her shoulders relaxed a bit. I am sorry, she said, her voice low and solemn. That must have been terrifying. Cedric shrugged. Well, yeah. I mean, I've trained for it my whole life. Really? He nodded, running a hand through his hair, any hint of a smile falling from his face. Years and years of extensive training ever since he could remember. He hadn't thought of it as training specifically because, from the moment he'd held a sword in his hand, he'd enjoyed it. His senses always seemed more in tune the second he could feel the weight of the steel settling into his palm. Part of him felt proud that he'd finally be able to put that to use, but the other part pointed out that most of his encounter was hand to hand, something that came mostly from his raw survival instinct. It wasn't the sword that had saved him that night. Thank you, Cedric said. For what? Gwen looked at him quizzically. I mean, she started. I really didn't do much. I almost stood there and almost let you get killed. I just stood there. Cedric raised an eyebrow at her, something his bruised skull protested. If you hadn't stepped in, I would be dead. Clearly you don't know what you're talking about. Gwen winced at his words. Don't. Please. Don't tell me I did good. Why? You saved my life. Because I almost failed. If I had waited any longer... But you didn't, he noted. But what if I had, Cedric? Her voice dripped shame, something Cedric just couldn't understand. After what she'd done, what did she have to hate herself for? She had risked her life, throwing herself at the assassin, and saving Cedric from whatever the man had planned. And then she had returned with soldiers just in time to stall Cedric's death yet again. Oh, kings, she muttered, burying her face in her cupped hands. I'm sorry. Your Highness. Gwen immediately corrected herself. I'm sorry. Yet another apology. I should have called me by my title, Cedric finished for her. She nodded, her hands moving with her head. Honestly, people use the title but don't listen to what I say. I prefer people listen and call me by who I am instead. Gwen nodded slowly. Sorry. No, Cedric laughed. You apologize too much. Own it. You don't have to be perfect. She gave him a sheepish smile, unconvinced by his words, though trying to hide it. "It feels like 3 years ago," she said suddenly. "Us talking?" "Kings, has it been that long?" Cedric grinned, forcing back the ache, and was rewarded as she smiled back. She nodded. "I can hardly believe it myself. I mean," she paused, looking him over, "you don't look 14 anymore."
"Nor do you. Where did you go and grow up?" "I stayed here."
I... She stopped, smiling wistfully for a moment. "I really couldn't say. A lot of places."
"Then why did you never come back?"
"I don't know. I went with Evander wherever he was going. I learned a lot."
"About medicine? That sounds boring."
"No, I'm going to leave that to my brother." Curious, Cedric questioned further.
"Then what did you learn?"
Gwyn wrinkled her nose at him, her lips pulling into a smile. "That's the question, isn't it?"
"Oh, so you're not going to tell me?"
"You have to earn it first."
"Oh, and holding off an assassin isn't enough."
"Ask me later, when my head can catch up with all of that." She suddenly stood up, finally seeming to notice the dried blood clinging to the end of her skirt. I should probably go. Evander will have my head if he finds out I've kept you up so late."
"I think he'd have both of our heads."
"I wouldn't be worried about him too much." Gwyn shrugged, looking at her hands. "He may be smart, but that's pretty much it. I don't think he could hold any power over you."
"He does if my father says he does."
"He really worries for you," Gwyn said.
"Who? Lord Evander? You must be joking."
Cedric would have chuckled a little if it weren't for the sweet solemnity of her voice. "No. Your father." She pursed her lips and gave him a meaningful look. "I saw how scared he was when he came into the courtyard after you fell. He almost seemed to crumple to dust while he was holding you." Worried, shouted words wound their way through Cedric's hazy memory. First, the hushed singing of his mother, and then Galorian. He was calling Cedric's name over and over, begging him to wake up. And then he found himself looking into the scared, worn gray eyes of his father. There was safety in those eyes, and Cedric remembered it clearly.
"Yeah, I know."
Cedric felt shame rise in his chest, burning his face past the effect of the alcohol used to clean it. He hadn't once asked after his father since the courtyard. He had been so preoccupied with... what, exactly? Evander's useless tests? Why hadn't his thoughts been more centered on what the king might have been going through after all that? A knock came at the door, and a moment later, Runen Verden entered, bowing stiffly at his waist.
"Prince Cedric,"
he said. His voice had always reminded Cedric of warm bread, sometimes hard on the outside, but full of care and genuine goodness.
"I came to see how you were faring."
Cedric couldn't help but offer a smile as the captain walked to the bed, stopping next to Gwyn. He squeezed Cedric's arm with a gloved hand.
"Lord Tadel said that you were already recovering."
Cedric nodded. "Apparently." He hesitated, looking to Gwyn, and then his hands. "How is my father doing?"
"He's hidden himself up in his study with a bottle of wine. I suppose that he won't show himself except to see you."
The lines creasing Runen's eyes deepened as he smiled with his whole face. But it was a sad smile, regretful and mournful.
"I'm sorry. If I had done better, this wouldn't have happened."
"Don't blame yourself. Really, it's not your fault." Gwyn cleared her throat, a small, rough sound, and she smiled nervously. "I should go. I'll, see you later." She dipped into a quick curtsy and nodded to Runen before turning on her heels and walking briskly towards the door. Cedric watched her go, his eyes following the bounds of her messy hair. Firelight reflected off of the curls, making them appear red and vibrant. Beautiful. He looked back to see Runan studying his face, dark eyes watching closely.
"She's pretty,"
he said, thick eyebrows perking with curiosity.
"Yeah, I guess she is. Why is that important?" "King, she saved your life, Prince Cedric. Are you meaning to tell me that that means nothing to you?"
he prodded. Cedric raised an eyebrow. "I hope you aren't inferring anything, Captain."
"No,"
Runan said, holding up his arms innocently.
"I'm simply saying."
Cedric's face stretched, giving the captain a disbelieving look. Runan only smiled.
"I'm just glad you seem to be recovering quickly." "Yeah, quickly. I'm still stuck in bed for the next lifetime." "And how long is a lifetime, Your Highness?"
2 days. Runan chuckled. "But," Cedric continued, feeling at the stitches across his cheek, "recently I learned that it might average out to be about 17 years.
"Not on my watch. Though I do have to ask why you sent away most of your guards. They are there to protect you, personally."
Cedric shrugged off the question. "I wouldn't be able to sleep with so many watching me. Lord Evander specifically made clear that I was supposed to get plenty of rest." He made the quotations with his hands and tried to mimic the doctor's voice, but Runan apparently didn't find it amusing.
"He's right."
"I know. I can't sit still knowing that something's going on. I have to do something, not just sit around as every possible available guard watches me dress."
"I get how you feel, Cedric, but you need to be wary. One failed attack will lead to another, despite our efforts to boost your security, and next time might end with a very different outcome."
Runan looked at Cedric, his gaze concentrated and stern.
"We don't want anything to happen to you."
Cedric nodded and looked away to avoid the captain's dark eyes. The man could be so serious. He could issue an order like it was a request, and make you feel like anything he said was true and honest. Sometimes he forgot that the captain of his father's guard had fallen away from the Vizanian beliefs, instead putting his faith in his own hands, not relying on the generous gifts of the kings.
"I thought you should know that we finished our search of the castle. We found no other threats. But 10 of my men are dead. All killed the same way."
"How?" Cedric was surprised to find his voice hoarse at the news. He didn't know any of these men, but they had always been there, and it had been a long time since he had heard of losing any one of them.
"Slit throat, right under the helm. They died quickly."
Cedric found himself nodding again as Runan's words began to sink in. 10. Dead. It was because of him. If he weren't there, then none of this would have happened. If he wasn't... He knew he shouldn't blame himself. What could he have done to prevent it? Perhaps not have sparred so late into the night. It didn't matter that he couldn't have stopped anything from hurting the men. Cedric still felt like it was somehow his fault. They died and he was still here.
"Thank you." "Rest well, Your Highness."
Runan dipped his head low to the prince.
"As soon as you are well again, we can start your training again. I suppose your father will be eager to see improvement as quickly as possible."
"Yeah, of course." The captain turned to leave, but right before he opened the door, he said quietly,
"Before you do anything brash, Prince Cedric, might I suggest trying to find answers first? The more you know, the more prepared you'll be. Perhaps you'll be interested in a trip to the dungeons to speak to our new captive before we set his execution date." And with that he was gone, leaving a ring of keys in his place.